One evening, Jesus is sitting down with his disciples and he says, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." Now, as Christians, we generally just accept these words without much question, right? This is the basis for Holy Communion. And despite our denominational differences about what those words really mean, we all agree on one thing. Jesus told us to do just that, eat his body and drink his blood. Which, let's be honest, it's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, if you're not a believer, that just sounds kind of strange. Early critics of Christianity heard these words and believed that Christians were cannibals, and it's not hard to see why. But what if there's more to these words than we realize? What if there was meaning in these words that was obvious to Jesus' Jewish audience, but is hidden to most of us? Well, if you'd like to really understand what Jesus meant by these words and what that original communion meal was really all about, then join me for this episode of Beyond the Words. Now, before we start, if you're interested in learning more insights that will help you to understand the Bible more clearly and see it with an entirely new set of eyes, then make sure to click the link above and down in the description where you can download a free book I wrote called 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. It's a quick but powerful read that will teach you a whole lot in just a short period of time, just like this video. Speaking of, let's dive in. In John's Gospel, Jesus says something very strange. He says, "I tell you the truth. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you cannot have eternal life within you. But anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise that person at the last day." Now, what's interesting about this verse is that it comes long before Jesus and the disciples share communion. Right, this moment comes at the beginning of John's Gospel, just after Jesus has fed the 5,000 and walked on water. Crowds of people have followed him around the Sea of Galilee and, believe it or not, are still asking him for a sign that proves that he's the Messiah, after he fed 5,000 of them with a few loaves and fish. But what is really important to notice is how they ask him for this sign, because it sets the tone for everything that's about to come next. John tells us, they answered, "Show us a miraculous sign if you want us to believe in you. What can you do? After all, our ancestors ate manna while they journeyed through the wilderness. The scriptures say Moses gave them bread from heaven to eat." So as they challenge Jesus, they refer back to the story of the Exodus. They recount how Moses gave them bread to eat, really referring to how God brought forth manna from heaven each day. In other words, it's as if they're saying, that thing you did with the bread back there on the other side of the lake, that was nice, but give us a real sign with bread, something like manna. And it's to that Jesus responds, "Then Jesus declared, 'I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever.'" In other words, Jesus is saying, you all are looking for a miracle with physical bread, something like manna, but that manna didn't last forever. Those people didn't last forever. You want something less than what I'm offering. I'm offering you a bread that leads to eternal life. But then Jesus takes it a step further, and he says something that almost certainly made his crowd uncomfortable. It's the verse that we looked at just a moment ago. Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you cannot have eternal life within you. But anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise that person at the last day." Now, to a Jewish listener, this statement makes things kind of awkward. I mean, it's one thing to hear Jesus promising bread, or even using bread as a metaphor for something else that he's offering. But now Jesus' words have gotten even more graphic, even more intense and literal. He's saying that you can't have eternal life unless you eat his flesh and drink his blood. And that just feels weird. You see, everyone in that crowd knows full well how the Jewish law feels about things like eating flesh and drinking blood. Leviticus says, "And if any native Israelite or foreigner living among you eats or drinks blood in any form, I will turn against that person and cut him off from the community of your people. For the life of the body is in its blood. I have given you the blood on the altar to purify you, making you right with the Lord. It is the blood given in exchange for a life that makes purification possible. That is why I have said to the people of Israel, you must never eat or drink blood, neither you nor the foreigners living among you." So the law is pretty clear about this. You don't eat human flesh and you don't drink blood. The people are wondering, how can this man call himself the Messiah and yet tell us that we have to do something that the law clearly prohibits? And here's the crazy thing. We never see Jesus give his audience an answer to questions like these. After Jesus finishes saying these things, John's gospel just moves on. When Jesus' disciples find out, it's not until much, much later. They don't ever really get a sense until later of what he means by all of this. And it's at the convergence of two really important events that helps explain everything. Luke's gospel tells us, then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And what Luke is describing here is the overlap of two Jewish celebrations, Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. Passover was the time spent remembering the last of the 10 plagues in Exodus, in which God passed over the homes of the Israelite people who had blood upon their doorframes, while taking the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, including the Pharaoh. It was this moment that forced Pharaoh's hand and caused him to free the Israelite people from slavery. The festival of unleavened bread, however, was different. This was a celebration of how the Israelite people were prepared for their freedom. God told them not to put any yeast in their bread as they departed Egypt. They needed to leave quickly, and there was no time to let the bread rise. Well, according to the Jewish calendar, as soon as Passover ended, the festival of unleavened bread began. And according to Luke, the Last Supper between Jesus and his disciples happens at the transition point between Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The Passover lamb is sacrificed on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, and then it is eaten after sunset, which marks the beginning of the 15th day of Nisan, the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. Now, while these might seem like confusing details, they actually really matter when we're trying to understand what Jesus means and what he does as he explains communion. Passover and the festival of unleavened bread are the lens through which the disciples see everything that's unfolding before them. I mean, they're in the middle of these celebrations. They can't help but see things in light of this. And if we really want to understand what Jesus is saying, we have to do the same thing. We have to remember that Jesus and his disciples are sharing a Passover Seder together as he says all of this. They're recalling specific scriptures. They're eating specific foods. They're drinking wine. They're reciting certain prayers. And they're seeing the connections between all of these things. So when Luke tells us he took some bread and gave thanks to God for it, then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After the supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed by my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." When we hear him say these things, we need to see these events through Jewish eyes. And when we do, some very specific things stand out. For instance, when Luke tells us that Jesus took bread, the bread that he's talking about is matzah, a bread made without yeast to remember how the Israelite people could not add yeast to their bread when they fled Egypt. It's also a reminder of the manna, the bread that God provided for them once they had left. When Jesus takes the cup, this is one of the 4 cups of wine served at Passover. It's a reminder of the blood that was shed by Pharaoh for generations, and the blood of the lamb upon the doorpost that spared the Hebrew people and set them free. When Luke tells us that Jesus gave thanks over the bread, he's referring to a Jewish prayer called a hamotzi, a traditional prayer that blesses God for allowing bread to come forth from the earth. He would have also blessed the wine with a prayer called the kiddush, a prayer that praises God for the fruit of the vine. And here's the thing. The hamotzi and the kiddush, they weren't just spoken at Passover. These were prayers that Jesus and his disciples would have prayed every week during their Shabbat meal. For them, bread and wine were just a regular part of life. Bread and wine had always been used to remember the Lord. Bread was associated with sustenance, with how God had always provided for the people. Wine was associated with celebration, rejoicing in the blessings of the Lord. All of this is about remembering. As they consume each of these things, as they recite these prayers, they remember who God is and what God has done for them. So when Jesus says, "Eat this bread and remember me," drink this wine and remember me, he's not doing something new. He's telling them to do what they've always done and to realize that these items now have even more meaning. He's not asking them to forget. He's not saying these things should no longer cause you to remember the Passover and the wilderness, right? This is their story. Instead, he's saying these things should now also remind you of me, of what I'm about to do for you. See, this bread, it's going to remind you of my body, which will be broken for you. This wine, it's going to remind you of my blood that will be shed for you, just like the blood of the lamb at Passover. And just as we dine now on a lamb whose blood was shed yesterday, so too you will dine with a lamb whose blood will be shed for you tomorrow. Remember these things, not as things that were, but as things that are. This is why I told you that you must eat my flesh and drink my blood so that you will remember. And I want us to be really careful with that word, remember, because it meant something different to Jesus and his disciples than it means to us. The act of remembrance on Passover wasn't a recollection of things that happened to some distant group of people long ago in the past. It was much more personal than that. You see, this is why during the Passover Seder, people don't say when they were slaves in Egypt. They say when we were slaves in Egypt. Because it's not history, it's memory. And just as you can recall your wedding day or the birth of your child as if it was yesterday, just as you can experience those feelings and those emotions all over again, just as you can be transported in your memory to the experience of the past as if it is present, Jesus is saying, that's what I want you to do here. Remember me. For this is not an event of the past, but an experience in the present and a promise for the future. For I am with you always. And in that same vein, Jesus makes another statement that ties everything together, something that his disciples interpreted much differently than we do. When he takes the wine, he says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." And that phrase, new covenant, really isn't all that new when he says it. Because when Jesus talks about this new covenant, he's actually referring to a past promise. He's referring to the prophet Jeremiah, who says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." And suddenly, everything Jesus has been saying, all the way back to his earlier statements in John 6, it all begins to come into focus. Jesus is saying, through me, you can experience this new covenant. Through me, things can be different than they were with your ancestors. Because through me, the word of the Lord will be upon your hearts. For no one has seen the Father except the one who is from God, and I am that one. I am the bread of life. I am the Word made flesh. Mine is the blood of the Lamb. And the only way to the Father is through me. This is why you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. For this new covenant can only be experienced through me. The law can only be upon your hearts if you have me. And so this is why you do these things that I command you, so that you will always remember me, lest like your ancestors you someday forget. And you must never forget. Let me ask you, do you remember what Jesus has done for you, not as a recollection of some past event, but as something that is real and present and eternal? Do you experience Jesus as the disciples experienced that Passover meal that night, not as history, but memory? And if not, what needs to change? Well, in the comments below, I'd love to hear what you think. How has this lesson changed the way you see communion? How will it change the way you experience it and celebrate it? Let me know your thoughts. And while you're at it, if you haven't done so already, make sure to download my free book, 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. There's a link up here and down in the description. And for another video like this one that will change the way you read the Bible, just click this link right here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a great week. Take care and God bless.